Welcome to Voices of Wentworth. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and by paying our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My name is Sophie Pollett and I'm one of the volunteers with Voices of Wentworth. Like our past town hall events, this session is also being recorded and will be available to watch on our website as well. We've put this panel together at relatively short notice in response to some dramatic developments in the national electricity market. A lot of people are struggling to understand how the market for electricity in Australia operates and how it's regulated, why the market has been suspended and what impact that will have on the public purse and on consumers and businesses, what can be done by governments in the short term and to prevent price shocks and the threat of blackouts, and whether households and businesses can take any steps to reduce the energy risks. So tonight, to examine the question of energy and how to fix it, we have Tim Buckley, who founded Climate Energy Finance Australia in 2022, having worked with the global think tank Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. Tim has 30 years of financial markets experience, specialising in equity valuation, including as a top-rated analyst and managing director of ESG fund ARC's Investment Management. We also welcome Alia Armistead, who is from the Australia Institute as a climate and energy researcher. Alia has conducted research on climate emergency declarations, climate risk, negative emissions technologies, carbon capture and storage, and energy grid maintenance. Alia attended COP24 in Poland as a youth delegate with Global Voices and has presented on panels at the National Climate Energy Summit and with the Young Australians in International Affairs. And we have Allegra MP, the federal member for Wentworth. Prior to the 2022 election, Allegra was the CEO for the Australian Business and Community Network, which mentors kids from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and has previously been chair on the Sydney Renewable Power Company. Welcome and thank you. Tonight, we'll be asking a series of questions we've gathered from our supporters across social media channels. Then we'll go to some live questions from our viewers. If you want to ask a question, please type your question into the chat as we will try and get through as many as we can. Please make sure that you put the word question in capital letters before your question so you can easily pick it out of we can easily pick it out of the comments. As a reminder, our town halls are generally forward-looking. We don't spend a lot of time going over past failings unless they are important to understanding how things can be done better in the future. So let's go. We'll start off with a few questions sent from our supporters before we move on to the questions from our chat. Alia, this one's for you. For background, how does the national electricity market work?
Thanks, Sophie, and hi, everybody. Very glad to be here. So happy to run through a little bit of how the national electricity market actually works. So we call it the NEM, and the NEM covers all states in Australia except for Western Australia and the Northern Territory. And it was combined to become a single market in 1998. And there's many government organisations that govern the operation of the NEM, including AEMO, the AEMC, the AER. I'm sure you've heard many of these acronyms in the last few weeks. And all of these organisations, along with the Energy National Cabinet, combine to form the Energy Security Board. So energy is generated in real time and released in real time as demand requires it. Prices also fluctuate in real time. So power generators make offers to the spot market, which we call the wholesale market. So these are wholesale prices, not the prices that consumers pay. And the wholesale prices make up a portion of consumers' electricity prices. Electricity prices also include retail costs and distribution costs and a number of other costs as well. And spot prices or wholesale prices are bound within a specific range, which I'm sure we'll come back to talk about later on. So generation in Australia is predominantly made up of coal. Generation in the NEM is predominantly made up of coal. In Western Australia, it's predominantly made up of gas. So coal is about 65% of our average generation, followed by gas, a large portion of renewables combined of distributed solar, grid scale solar, wind energy and hydro. And the Australian Energy Market Operator, or AEMO, decides which generators will be deployed at any moment in time to produce electricity based on the prices that each generator can offer to the electricity grid. And this is a constantly ongoing process. So I might leave it there, and I'm sure we can come back to further questions.
Thank you. Tim, can you give us a bit of an indication on why energy prices are spiking?
Certainly, and good evening all. Firstly, global energy prices are absolutely skyrocketing. The prices have gone ballistic for oil, for gas, and for coal. And obviously, a lot of that is driven by Putin's war in Ukraine, and also the restrictions that Putin made on supply into Europe before the war, before the invasion of Ukraine, and now subsequent to the war, or ongoing, is embargoes. So the West is embargoing Russian supply. Russia is the second largest fossil fuel exporter in the world. So when you restrict supply from the second largest exporter, that creates a global shock. It's worth bearing in mind for all of the spin the federal government, the ex-federal government has put on for the last 9 years. Australia is the third largest fossil fuel exporter in the world. So we as a country should be a huge beneficiary, but we're not. We're absolutely not a beneficiary of this unprecedented hyperinflation in all fossil fuel commodities. So there are two key reasons for that. And when I say we, I'm talking about the Eastern Australian market. As Alia mentioned, the NEM is the Eastern market. I'll come back to why I emphasise that. So it's impacting 22 million Australians. The 3 million in the West are actually protected because of sensible West Australian government regulatory framing 15 years ago. So two key reasons why domestic prices are skyrocketing in the last couple of months. Firstly, end-of-life coal-fired power plants are increasingly unreliable. That is absolutely categorically a key aspect. As Alia also mentioned, coal is the major source of power generation in electricity in the NEM, and we have a very aging fleet. And so for all the rhetoric from the from our federal government that used to be in charge, coal is neither affordable nor reliable when it's end of life. The second aspect, the federal government in 2015 opened up the East Coast gas market to huge amounts of exports. So production in the East Coast has trebled, and yet we moved to export price parity and beyond. Our federal government, in conjunction with the multinational gas cartel that controls the gas supply in the Eastern Australian market, what the federal government failed to do was provide any protection whatsoever for the Eastern Coast domestic industry or consumers. And when fossil gas is actually the price setter for electricity for 22 million Australians, and the price of gas goes up tenfold, we have a domestic gas crisis as bad as the global gas crisis, as the global energy crisis. And it's worth bearing in mind, there are certain fossil fuel companies making unprecedented wartime profits, wartime profiteering. And so where 22 million Australians are paying huge, huge prices for this, there are certain companies who are profiteering. So we might come back to that point later.
Allegra, did you have anything to add on why energy prices are spiking?
Look, I think another way of just framing it, and I agree with everything that Tim just laid out in terms of that analysis. I think there are two things. One is, as you described, as Tim just described, a failure of policy settings in relation to the fossil fuel market, and particularly the gas market and coals. But the second piece is actually about a failure of action on renewables, because when you look at you look at the ACT, which is the one state of this country where one of the two states where the energy prices aren't spiking. That's because they've moved to 100% renewables. And the real difference, I think, between fossil fuels and renewables is that once you build the solar panels and the wind, the price doesn't change. While the price that we pay for gas is, as Tim described, driven by the global markets. So the fact that if we had invested further in renewables and firmed renewables, because I think it's not just renewables, but you need absolutely the firming on that, then we would have much greater price certainty and be much less exposed to the international spikes in fossil fuel prices. So I think you need to look at both, you know, and you look at that, or it's not only, we're talking probably primarily about the electricity market, but we should also be aware of the cars, because, you know, last petrol station I just drove past, it's over I saw $2.30, like it's absolutely insane. And that is with $3 billion of public money gone into the fuel price excise rebate or sort of reduction. So I think that this is about Australia's dependency on fossil fuels, even the ones that we make here, means that we're exposed to global price shocks, like driven by Ukraine and other issues. And that means that Australian consumers are exposed by and large by that, except in Western Australia.
That leads on to Alia. Is the growth of renewables to blame for these blackouts and spiking prices? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's coming back to what Allegra and Tim have just said. So renewables are actually the solution to the problem that we're facing at the moment. They're absolutely not the cause of any of the energy crisis that we've been dealing with for the last few months. So these problems have been caused by gas, by coal, and renewables is the direction that we're absolutely going in. And the current federal government acknowledges that. And the agencies that are in charge of operating the energy market also acknowledge that we currently have an energy market that is in transition, and it is transitioning rapidly, even faster than government agencies have been modeling. So coal retirements have been closing of their own will, not because of government policy or governments forcing them to transition. They've been closing because it's uneconomic for them to continue operating. And AEMO forecasts that coal will continue to close faster than they have previously been forecasting. So every year they expect that coal will continue to close faster than they previously thought it would. And the solution to this problem is that we have, as Allegra said, more renewable energy in the system, and we create a system that is designed for renewable energy so that we can firm it and we can ensure that we have reliable and secure energy at all times that is also good for the climate, which means low emissions energy.
Allegra, on a local level, is this situation impacting people in Wentworth? What have you been hearing from our constituents?
Look, I think there is a lot of concern about this, and I think this is a lot of people concerned both for their homes and their families, but also for business. So many people in Wentworth run businesses, and you know, there's I think let's start with the business for us at the moment. You've got there are some businesses that are particularly exposed because they use they have gas, and there's been and so they're particularly exposed to these gas spikes in prices because they're using that as a key input, and that really makes them very, very vulnerable to these shocks in energy. And you see some businesses, not so much in Wentworth, but quite a lot in Victoria, who have said that they've had to, you know, stand down shifts and things like that based on the energy spikes. I think then you have just your normal businesses who are facing, you know, the same sort of pressures that households are facing, which is we're facing, you know, wage spikes from at a business level. You're facing increasing costs of borrowing, and now you're facing increase. You know, we've got supply chain issues across the world, and now we've got energy costs increasing, and that's similar to households where they're facing, you know, interest rate rises at home. Increase inflation more broadly, and now energy. So it's really is hurting people, and I think there's a real concern coming into the new financial year when about what that's going to mean, you know, for households with those other inflationary pressures. So it is, I have to say, it really is hurting people, and I think and it's part of a broader economic, you know, pain that I think families are going through right now.
Tim, what has been done and what can be done by the federal government in the short term?
Yes, there are actually price caps that have been established in Australia for the retail users of electricity in particular. And so, to the point that Allegra made, consumers across the country, across Eastern Australia, across Wentworth, are hurting. But the reality is the pain's going to be a hell of a lot more because the profit margins have been totally destroyed with the wholesale price of electricity going up 300, 400, 500% in the last couple of months. So you might have seen in the press how we've lost Novo this week, one of the New South Wales renewable energy retailers. We saw Western go under. We've seen Pooled Energy go under. So we've seen four independent retailers going bankrupt in the space of a couple of weeks from this emergency. This is not unprecedented. The UK has lost 40 independent retailers in the same couple of months. And so at the end of the day, at the moment, there's a bit of a buffer. The companies are absolutely getting in the neck. Anyone exposed to the wholesale price of energy is seeing their bill going up 400%. We were hearing of how businesses are having to shut down. They just can't afford to actually buy electricity at 400, 500% of what they were paying only 6, 12 months ago. So in the short term, though, we have seen the Australian regulatory body step up to try and minimise the damage, contain the chaos or energy policy chaos that we've got. Energy crisis is the word I was thinking of. The Australian energy market operator, Australian energy regulator last week actually came in and demanded that fossil fuel generators had to actually turn on and operate, that it reminded them they were essential services. Energy is an essential service. They might be privatized, but they have an essential service obligation. Those same companies ignored the Australian energy regulator. One day later, AEMO, the Australian energy market operator, as Alia mentioned, actually then suspended the market. Now, that's unprecedented. We have never seen the national electricity market price suspended. At the end of the day, we had a crisis. It was spiraling out of control. There was profit gouging going on, and we had thermal power generators with holding capacity in the middle of peak demand. It was just unprecedented, and we have had a regulatory response. So in the short term, you have to respond with unprecedented power when you have a crisis underway. Fortunately, the federal government has allowed the regulators to do that, and they're trying now to actually restore some level of semblance. We did have COAG, the coalition of the Australian governments, meet 2 weeks ago, and they acknowledged that short term, there's not a lot they can do, but what they can do is make sure we learn from the crisis and we actually come out of it better prepared for the next time. So COAG, for the first time in a decade, has actually the federal government working in alignment with the state governments of Australia and the territories, and committing to an accelerated deployment of renewable energies for exactly the reason that Alia mentioned. Renewables are the low-cost, domestic, zero-emissions source of generation, and the more renewables, the less energy crisis we will be having in the future. So COAG's committed to an accelerated deployment of renewables. To Allegra's point, it has to be firmed renewables, and the federal government also has introduced or has been elected with a commitment to build $20 billion of new grid transmission across Australia to make sure that we can, at the end of the day, it's not always windy in one particular part of Australia, but it's invariably going to be windy in Bass Strait or in far north Queensland or somewhere in between at any point of the day or night. So the bigger we have a strong grid, the more we can leverage a higher and higher penetration of renewables. So at the end of the day, we need to acknowledge there's a domestic crisis, the short-term crisis, there is a long-term climate crisis we need to solve for both, and there are different solutions required for each.
Allegra, are you satisfied with what the government has done in the short term?
Look, I think, I think that like in broad terms, yes, but I think that the government should be putting more pressure on the gas companies, and particularly around the prices that Australian energy, generators and then retailers, are passing on, because I think, I'm actually not one, generally who believes in sort of intervening in markets if they're well established, but if they're not well established, or if there's a true, wartime situation, which I think we're facing with Ukraine, then I think there should be intervention when there's policy market failure. And I think when we go back to the principle of this, Australia only ever the East Coast was only opened up to export markets of gas back in 2015. So before then, we never exported gas out of the East Coast, and we only did it with the view that we never did it with the view that Australia was going to then be victim to some sort of energy crisis like we are here. And I think, we need to recognise that energy is an absolute essential part of our economy. And so it is an absolutely essential that we get energy at an affordable price into this country. That's absolute. It's a national security issue. It's sort of fundamental to our economy. Therefore, I think that the government must be putting on greater pressure on the gas companies to say, look, guys, there's a war in Ukraine. You're making extra profits because of a war in Ukraine, and Australian households are going to be paying the price of this. This doesn't pass, as I described, the pub test, that you get to make extra money because there's a war in Ukraine, and the Australian people whose gas it is you're making the money on, you're not getting any of, I think, the benefit or relief in terms of, the profits you're making. So I think they need to put more pressure on the companies. I think they're doing some of that behind the scenes, but, in certainly some of the public rhetoric, I feel like they're being too soft actually on the gas companies. And I think they should be going harder and saying, look, we have limited options, but if you don't come to the party and come to the party better, then you're not going to like what it looks like in terms of, other sort of tax and other opportunities for, the government to claw this back for the Australian people.
Sophie,
Alia, sorry, go.
can I maybe just jump in, because I 100% agree with Allegra's comment. Markets are great, but when you have total regulatory failure and when you have total market failure, you need the governments to intervene. Exactly as Allegra said, this is Australia's gas. It is a public asset that has been given to private companies to use, and that is fine, except when they were approved their development in 2015 of their 6 LNG export trains, those gas companies said they would have no impact on the domestic East Australian gas market. Now, the regulator and the government, unfortunately, took them at their words and failed to put any protections whatsoever in place. When Western Australia 15 years ago had the same proposition, the Western Australian government said, that's fine, we are going to reserve 15% of our gas for our domestic industry and our domestic consumers. Western Australia is sailing through the Eastern crisis that 22 million Australians are paying for, and a lot of our industry is paying for, without any impact. And at the end of the day, they put in protections. They said the gas company can export the surplus, not the core, the surplus. And so we have a total regulatory failure. In the middle of a failure, as Allegra said, you actually have to intervene. You have to reset the rules to make sure that domestic customers are served first and we export the surplus.
Thank you. Alia, in the short to medium term, what specifically can individuals and businesses do to address energy costs or risk of blackouts?
Yeah, look, that's a tricky one. And I just want to add quickly to what Tim and Allegra have said. So not only is this problem largely created by the gas industry in Australia is very largely made up of multinational companies who, on a large part, do not pay company tax and do not pay any royalties on the resources that they are extracting and sending overseas for huge profit margins. Not entirely, but largely. And so we have this problem where Australians are being charged through the roof and paying companies these prices for their profits, and we actually are getting nothing in return. So what individuals and businesses can do, unfortunately, it is largely out of their hands because this crisis has been many, many years in the making. But because we know that renewables and storage are the solution, individuals do have some agency if they're lucky enough to be able to get renewables and storage for themselves on their households. And so electrification is something that is, as an individual, is also a solution to this problem. So if you're not hooked up to gas in your house, then chances are you're not going to be paying the exorbitant gas prices that everyone else will be paying. So electrification of households can save households up to $5,000 per year. So these are the kinds of things that individuals, if we're fortunate enough, can actually do. And we need to be putting pressure on governments to support not only changes at the energy electricity market wide scale for these reforms and these changes to our energy makeup, but also supporting households to be able to electrify their appliances, to be able to get renewables and storage in their homes, and to be able to potentially buy electric vehicles and use electric vehicles as batteries as well. So these are all the technologies that will be coming online. And the sooner we do all of this, the better it will be for individuals and businesses.
Allegra, have you got any thoughts on what specifically individuals and businesses can do?
Look, I think just to add, I agree very much with what Alia said. I think the piece about appliances, I think, is a really one well made. And I think the leading academic and inventor in Sol Griffith, who has worked a lot in this space and has done a lot of the modelling, it's really showing that basically Australian households, as they look at choices of appliances, as as cars, as fridges, as dryers, all those appliances effectively wear out. The choices have to be the most efficient one and the one that is the lowest carbon one, and the electric one. So moving away from gas cooking to and gas heating to electric, electric cooking, electric heating. Induction stoves, for those of you who don't like those, the sort of not traditional electric stovetop, and similarly with appliances, and similarly with the next vehicle. And this is not going to happen overnight for most families, because they can't bring forward, the thousands of dollars worth of change that is. But this is the piece that every time you make a decision about an appliance, I think we need to start making more and more decisions based with the lifetime cost of running that appliance and thinking about the electricity costs. And similarly, I know not everybody has the opportunity to put solar on their roofs and batteries, but again, these are I think there's an opportunity, if you can, great. And I think there's another area for government to be looking at, which is how do we make it easier, for renters and apartment dwellers to get access to solar and and solar resources, for example. How do you make it easier for people who don't have their own driveways or garages to be able to use to have an electric car and have that vehicle infrastructure? So there's a bunch of stuff that has to happen on the policy area, and then there's a bunch of stuff that individuals and families can control more.
Allegra, maybe you can also talk about what medium and long-term solutions should the federal government be pursuing?
Look, I think, there's a bunch of different things there. I mean, I think the main piece is about having a long-term plan for the transition of our economy, actually, as well as particularly our electricity grid, into clean energy, because it is the cheapest form of energy that we have, and it's obviously really important for the environment. So that means basically, I think what they have done well actually in the COAG process recently is give AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, the responsibility for coming up actually with a transition plan for the Australian electricity market. And that's what we need. We need basically a plan that we can all get behind and is going to avoid, I think, the sort of lurching that has been happening over the last few years, as the federal government has pulled back policy that the other states and companies have been following. We actually all need to work together. So the first piece, I think, is we need to have that long-term plan in terms of our transition. I think there's much of what the Labor government has, which I really support. I think there's some big opportunities in areas first, like such as having fuel efficiency standards on cars, which would actually drive more choice in electric vehicles in this country. And I think that's absolutely critical. And so, in the UK, they have 130 odd models of electric vehicles that are available. In Australia, it's about 30 models. And that's purely because we don't have fuel efficiency standards, which covers almost 80% of the world's cars. So we're really missing a trick there. And it's a simple piece that will just give Australians more choice. Then I think there's obviously, what we should be doing more broadly, like I've been a strong advocate of stopping government money into fossil fuel projects as a starting point, clawing back the sort of $10 billion worth of subsidies that are paid, fossil fuel subsidies that the Australian government currently covers, and then really looking at, very, very hard on whether we should be increasing any of our sort of gas and, coal programs, new projects at all in the future. So I think that's I think the sort of change in policy settings, and that I would like to see the government make, because the government at the moment has is moving in the right direction, but I think we can go further and faster, and I think we can do this in a way that is actually good for the Australian economy.
Alia, have you got any...
and Australian families actually, and businesses.
Sorry, Allegra. Alia, what are your thoughts on solutions the federal government should pursue?
Yeah, I agree with everything Allegra has just said. So I think the last decade we've seen some forecasting of what transition was happening and kind of dealing with problems as they came up, but we really lacked the really integrated planning and policy implementation to deal with problems as they arose and understand what kind of future we're going towards. And I think we've not been able to see this as an opportunity. So this energy transition and climate transition more broadly is an opportunity for all of us to really change the way we live our lives for the better. And I think this government is taking some really positive steps so far. And many of the ones that Allegra just said, like transitioning out of fossil fuel subsidies, reforming the way that we think about electric vehicles, and there's a whole suite of policies that we can use to incentivize electric vehicles. These are the kinds of things that we really need to be implementing now, and not thinking that we will need them in 5 to 10 years' time. We need them right now.
Allegra, could a windfall profits tax help to build renewables quicker?
Look, and just be one, I think I'm about to get one of my children walking in. So if you hear a little bit of moaning in the background or someone disappearing. Look, I think what I've said about windfall profits tax is to say what I said earlier, which is I think the government should be looking at every single option on the table and really and quite aggressively talking those through, particularly with the gas companies. In terms, it could be a windfall profit tax, it could be using our current sort of PRRT resources tax and actually changing that so that actually more money will be raised by that tax, because at the moment is very little money is being raised by that tax. Those could be used by the government to, I think, make to actually raise revenue for for the Australian taxpayer, and also potentially cushion some of the costs of living increases that we're seeing. That said, I think they're not the only options, and I'm not. And I think the government should be working, particularly with the gas companies, to say, to using that a bit as a stick and say, well, what are you going to do to make sure that we can get through this in the short term?
Tim, have you got anything to add to that?
I would love to give Allegra a chance. Yes, I 100% agree. We don't want to all be in agreement on everything, but at the end of the day, I think there is the perfect example this week of political courage. And I'm going to, it's Cameron Dick is the Treasurer of Queensland, and he has just initiated a windfall royalty uplift on Queensland coal exports. It will have zero impact on any domestic customer because it only applies to windfall gains, and the windfall gains are made in exports. So this will not impact any industry or any consumer in Australia, but it will bring in potentially $20 billion of revenues to the Queensland government in just the next 12 months if prices stay where they are today. Now, what he's done is a very progressive royalty system. I think it's brilliant. I really applaud it. And I think we should reevaluate. New South Wales, unfortunately, just had on the same day, on Tuesday, our budget for the state. And unfortunately, Matt Keane left a $20 billion tax windfall on the table. All of that is off to Yancoal in China, Glencore in their tax havens, Peabody in their tax havens. So all of that money is just going straight into the pockets. It's a windfall gain from war profiteering. Queensland's grabbed it. If the price stays at unprecedented highs, the Queensland consumer, the Queensland ratepayers and taxpayers will get potentially a $20 billion windfall gain in the next 12 months. Royalties a year ago were $1.7 billion in Queensland. They were $7 billion in the last 12 months. That's in the numbers for this year, end of June. They could potentially be 20 or 25 billion in the next 12 months for Queensland. Unfortunately, New South Wales lacked political courage And unfortunately, I think it's a sign of regulatory capture where the coal industry has said, no, we're quite happy paying a 7 or 8% royalty. Whereas in Queensland, Cameron Dick has said, this is a public Queensland asset. We want 40% of the ultra record high prices you're getting. If the price drops tomorrow, Queensland gets nothing, none of that supernormal profits. But if the price stays at the all-time record high coal price it is today, then Queenslanders share 40% of the upside from $300 a tonne. It is exceptionally sensible policy. Exactly as Allegra said, that then delivers the Queensland government $20 billion of windfall profits, one-off probably. Let's assume the coal price goes back down where it's been for the last 50 or 100 years. It's at the moment unprecedented high. So at the end of the day, the Queensland government can now share $20 billion of windfall gains if the coal price stays where it is for the next 12 months to help cushion all of the people of Queensland. I would hope they would actually send that to the bottom 20 or 30% and really protect those most suffering from the energy gouging of the fossil fuel industry. And I'll repeat what Allegra said, the PRRT, the Petroleum Rent Resources Tax, is the federal tax on offshore oil and gas exports. That PRRT has been an abject policy regulatory failure for 20 years. We are currently getting a 3.5% royalty on offshore oil and gas. In Qatar, they get 35% royalty. In India, in coal, they get a 40% royalty. We get a 3.5% royalty in the PRRT. So I would be calling on the federal government to do a very similar thing to what the Queensland Treasurer, Cameron Dick, just did. And I would say that is very, very politically strong of him to do it. And I really congratulate him. And I would hope that our federal government, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, has the same fortitude. And then I'd also call on the Western Australian Premier, who's also the Treasurer of Western Australia, to think about putting in a progressive royalty on iron ore. Iron ore sales from Australia are primarily controlled by 5 companies. They are making a 90% profit margin. Their price has gone up 100, 200%, and Western Australia gets a 7.5% royalty. Why don't they follow Cameron Dick's leadership and actually put a progressive royalty in there? We are talking about tens of billions of dollars of royalty income that could go to Western Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, and the federal government. Tens, like 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 billion dollars of windfall taxes. And that could solve a huge amount of energy poverty over the next 12 months in Australia.
Thanks, Tim. Tim, can you also talk us through, the media's been talking about the capacity mechanism. What is it and how does it keep the lights on?
Yeah, the capacity mechanism, it sounds good. We've just seen the Energy Security Board's paper on it, but I would remind everyone that the Energy Security Board wrote this paper last year under direction from Angus Taylor, the Minister for Increasing Emissions and for increasingly unreliable coal power and skyrocketing energy prices. So that's Angus Taylor, the ex-energy minister, just to slam him a little bit for the chaos he's given Chris Bowen. But this paper was written at his bequest. I would also remind the ESB, the Energy Security Board, when they released this paper, they failed to take into account the guidance that the Coalition of Australian Governments gave them 2 weeks ago to bring in a recommendation for a new policy to promote firmed renewable energy and storage. And the emphasis is on new. The COAG ministers did not ask the Energy Security Board to design a great big new subsidy for existing coal and existing gas producers. I am bewildered that the ESB would release such a stupid paper.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go for some questions now from all of you. I'm going to start off with Jane. Thank you for asking this. Tens of thousands of residents, both owners and tenants, are living in strata schemes with embedded networks. Developers are getting infrastructure in return for long-term contracts with a supplier. Consumers have no visibility or choice. Can the panel please talk about the issue and what the solutions could be? Who would like to kick it off?
That's enough, Paul. You're not on mute. Alia, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to, or Allegra?
Go for it, Tim.
I do know, Paul. Right, at the end of the day, we do need regulations for the energy market, for the electricity market that are fit for purpose. The reality is Australia leads the world in many respects in distributed energy penetration. We've got the highest rooftop solar penetration in the world. And so the regulations need to modernise, and it's a real task for the Australian Energy Market Operator, the AEMC, the ESB, to actually try and keep up with the speed of technology disruption that's going through. But as the question alludes to, we do need regulations that are fit for purpose and protect all Australian consumers. It's quite easy for someone who's in a freestanding house with a large roof space, with a garage, to put electric vehicles charging in behind the meter, to put storage behind the meter, to put rooftop solar in. It's a completely different kettle of fish for anyone in strata or in rentals. So we do need to have the regulations modernised and fit for purpose for the emerging regulations. So whether that's community batteries, whether that is for strata, whether it's community solar, all sorts of new designs. And yeah, it's a complex area. The technology is moving fast. The grid needs to be modernised. I did mention Chris Bowen and Anthony Albanese have a $20 billion grid modernisation program. That is going to be really important. The grid's got to be modernised because we are going to have two-way power flows. We're going to have electric vehicle charging everywhere. We're going to have solar everywhere, and distributed solar, rooftop solar. So we need regulatory upgrades, and I'm not a regulatory designer. It's going to be complex. It's going to be difficult to make it fair, but it has to be equitable for this energy transition to bring everyone along.
Alia, do you have anything to add?
No, only to say that I guess we can go back to the capacity market on this question in terms of what kinds of regulatory solutions we're proposing. And the capacity mechanism is an extremely complex solution to an already complex market that we've just seen the government have to get AEMO to intervene in because it wasn't working and functioning in a fit for purpose way that was serving customers. And the national electricity market should be operating in the interest of customers, primarily people who are using the energy, not people who are creating the energy. And so I think we need to think long and hard about the kinds of solutions that we're proposing and not trying to solve complex problems with potentially complex and more convoluted solutions like a capacity market that won't be in the interests of consumers.
Allegra?
Look, I just wanted to add on this. I think there's parts about the market, and there's also parts about sort of local state government around planning, and how we build buildings, and what sort of what are the rules and regulations around that. So I know that I think Waverley Council is trying to do some work particularly around this. I think there's also innovation happening in the solar space where solar providers are trying to design, I think, solutions that work better for strata owners. So there's going to be, as I think we've alluded to, I think there's going to be there needs to be some change in the regulation. There needs to be change actually in terms of building and planning. And there also needs to be that innovation in the market. One thing I think a good example of where we might get to is in the UK, there's an organisation called Octopus Energy, and they are an energy company where if you're part of their group, you can actually charge your car for free in the day if you do it when the sun is shining effectively. So I think what I think is really exciting about this is that there's this opportunity, if we get these things right, for consumers to actually be, helping the grid by taking electricity off when we need it, and actually being incentivized and getting the financial benefit of getting the electricity when the market really wants the electricity out of the system. So I think that's the exciting part, but there's a whole bunch of really hard work, and I think quite detailed work to get to that.
Thank you. Okay, question from Robin. Do the coal and gas exporters pay royalties and or tax for exports of these Australian-owned assets?
I'll maybe just expand on the answer I gave. Yes, they do pay royalties. Queensland has a really good royalty. It starts at 7% in a normal environment. They pay 70%. If the price goes through the roof, they pay 12.5%, then 15%, then 20%, then 30%, then 40%. As the price keeps going up and up and up, it's now at 1 in a 100-year event, and their prices are $375 a ton, and the royalty cuts in at 40% of anything over 300 Aussie dollars a ton. So as I mentioned, that's going to, if these prices stay, we are talking about a $20 billion a year windfall for the Queensland government. New South Wales, we get 7% on underground, 8% on open cut coal, irrespective of whether the price is $50 or $500. And so I think that has to be readdressed. As to them paying corporate tax, most of the fossil fuel resources of Australia are owned by multinationals who sit in tax havens. Most of them have paid next to no tax in the last decade. If you want to be sickened, have a look at Michael West's 40 top tax avoiders in Australia. I think he's got the new data from the Australian Tax Office coming out in the next week or two. It is just criminal that we have 40 of the biggest multinationals operating. Almost all of them are multinationals, and they operate with a massive competitive advantage against any domestic Australian company. So someone like Woodside, okay, there might be a fossil fuel company and I might be attacking them, but the reality is they do pay corporate tax in Australia. They have Australian board, they have Australian shareholders, Australian management, and they pay Australian corporate tax. Chevron does not, Exxon does not. They do not pay any corporate tax in Australia, and therefore Chevron and Exxon have an unfair competitive advantage against their onshore Australian. That is just us about. The Australian government should be putting in regulations that protect and level the playing field and hold multinationals to account. And so particularly at a time of wartime profits hearing going on, these corporates should be paying some corporate tax. And we're talking probably $10 to $20 billion a year, bearing in mind the federal deficit that Jim Chalmers has inherited and is trying to now manage is in the order of, what, 80 billion. So he could solve maybe a quarter of it overnight by getting these top 20 multinationals in Australia paying a quarter of the tax their Australian peers pay. And I'll go back to something Allegra said as well, the diesel fuel rebate. The federal government of Australia for 60 years has let the mining industry, most of which is fossil fuels and iron ore, get a $7 to $9 billion a year diesel fuel rebate. Every one of us pays diesel tax, oil tax, petrol tax every time we fill up our internal combustion engine car, but not the mining companies, not the fossil fuel companies. Why are they exempted? At the end of the day, that actually dramatically increases the energy insecurity in Australia because we import all of our diesel and oil. So I would be very, very strongly advocating. Allegra mentioned we should remove the $11 billion a year of subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. I think that's an Australia Institute paper, highly recommended reading for everyone. But the biggest tax subsidy that the diesel fuel is the diesel fuel rebate. $7 to $9 billion a year just for these mega companies. You could cap it at maybe $50 million per company per year, and that would probably save Australian taxpayers $4 or $5 billion a year. Wouldn't affect a single farmer, would not affect a single SME, but it would hit the top 10 multinationals operating in Australia and stop letting them get an exemption that no one else gets. So, and I'll just finish by saying the diesel fuel rebate is the number 20 largest item in the federal budget, like number 20. Just to put it in context, it's one of the top 20 expenses to the federal government. It's the diesel fuel rebate. They've had it for 60 years, and it's actually preventing the electrification of their mining fleets.
They actually spend more on the fuel tax rebate than they do on public schools or on the Australian Army or on Navy capabilities, to put it into perspective of how much money that is. And in the previous financial year, it was $8.07 billion on the fuel tax rebate. And almost half of that goes directly to mining companies. And the coal mining industry is the single largest recipient of the fuel tax credit. So we include that as a fossil fuel subsidy in our fossil fuel subsidies tracking research, because it incentivizes these businesses to keep consuming fossil fuels, and it makes them significantly cheaper for them to do so.
Okay, I've got a question from Zacharias. Outlets like Renew Economy have extensively covered the various ways that some power generators game the wholesale market. What types of gaming is happening and how widespread is it?
I'm happy to talk about what happened in the last week briefly. So what happened was energy prices were skyrocketing, and AEMO had to intervene because the prices of the wholesale price was higher than the cap. And so they intervened, put a cap on prices, and then capacity was withdrawn from the market because the generators decided that under the price cap that they were allowed to charge, they weren't making enough profits, or it wasn't covering their cost of generation. So they withdrew capacity. When you withdraw capacity, AEMO can intervene and order generators to generate and provide electricity to the market. But when that happens, they get compensated at a higher rate than they would have under the price cap. So generators have been accused of withdrawing capacity so that they would then have to be ordered to start generating electricity again and would get compensated at a higher rate. The Australian Energy Regulator had a public letter to the generators and said that this is technically against the national energy rules and that they would be keeping an eye on generators who were performing this type of activity. But the rules in some ways do allow for this type of behaviour to happen. So that's one example of the way that gaming the system can be happening at the moment.
Thank you. We've had a couple of questions about nuclear energy, including one from Dominic Wykenak. What does the panel think about modular nuclear option and your thoughts on nuclear energy more broadly? Who would like to?
So we don't have a nuclear industry in Australia. By legislation, we are not allowed to have a nuclear industry in Australia. So that's the first point, that it would be a lot of work undoing legislation if we wanted to have a nuclear industry in Australia. Nuclear energy is also one of the most expensive forms of energy in the world. So there really is no reason that we would go down that path when we have extremely cheap renewables, and we know that new renewables and renewables that are firmed with storage is still cheaper than most other types of energy. The CSIRO Gen Cost report consistently puts nuclear energy as one of the most expensive forms of energy that we could possibly go down, the route that we could possibly go down. And as Tim loves to say, there is not a single small nuclear reactor operating in the world. So we don't need to be using these types of technologies. We have all the technologies that we need at our disposal. We don't need technologies that haven't been proven to work, that we're not allowed to use in this country, and that are prohibitively expensive.
Thank you. Okay, a question from David.
Sorry, Sophie,
Yep,
I might jump in. That was a brilliant answer. Thanks, Alia. I might just throw in another couple of data points in there, because this question comes up all the time about nuclear. I'll actually maybe contradict something Alia said. Pretend it won't be. Internationally, nuclear will be part of the energy system for decades and decades to come. It will be part of the Chinese energy system for the next 50 years. China is still building nuclear as we speak. But the reality is, exactly as Alia said, the cost of nuclear generation is prohibitive. You only have to have a 5-minute read of Hinkley Point C in the UK to realise that it's a decade behind schedule. It's already double the capital cost that the government offered. The price is £120 a megawatt hour. You can buy wind at £50 or £60 a megawatt hour, and the 120 for the nuclear is indexed at 3.5% per annum for the next 35 years, whereas the wind price will go down every year. So it is just criminally expensive, even in a market like the UK, where they don't have a lot of alternatives. You could Google the American nuclear power operations of Georgia. Georgia is, or Voltago, their nuclear power plants there, I don't know, $25 billion to build one nuclear facility. It's 10 to 20 years behind schedule. Ratepayers will be paying for that through the neck for the next 50 years at 5 times the price of wind or solar or even coal or gas. Why anyone talks about nuclear without actually reading up on Hinkley Point C, the Finnish nuclear power plant, the French nuclear power plant, you cannot build nuclear without massive, massive government capital subsidies. You cannot get rid of the nuclear waste, and it is criminally expensive. Anyone who wants to build a nuclear reactor in Australia is suggesting we either use Chinese or Russian nuclear technology. All right? Westinghouse used to be American technology. The Chinese now own it. So anyone who's asking for us to build a nuclear power plant is saying, let's choose between Russian technology or Chinese technology. As Alia said, we have no domestic nuclear capacity at all, and we won't in the next 10, 20, 30, or 1,000 years because it's just criminally expensive.
Mm-hmm. I just also want to add one point to that, which is that I think from a climate point of view and actually from an economic point of view, it's the next 8 to 10 years is absolutely critical. And what we need to be doing is moving fast, because it's what we need from a science point of view, but it's also actually the economic opportunity for Australia is to move quickly in terms of renewables and become a clean energy superpower. And nuclear just can't deliver that. Even if we actually had the skills, it couldn't deliver that. And as Tim said, we don't have the skills. So I think, there's a speed of deployment. And I think the other piece is just to bear in mind why Australia is so different. A solar panel in this country creates 2 to 3 times more electricity than it does in places in Europe. So the relative cost of solar and wind in Australia is quite different just because of, frankly, our blessings. And so, the economic, sort of skills aside and, people's views on nuclear aside, it's just that, all countries should play to their competitive advantage in terms of energy, and the energy future for Australia is absolutely solar and wind because we're just so well endowed. So it's a real distraction, I think, to be talking about nuclear. We've got all the answers that we need to be able to really transform the economy in a really positive way.
Allegra, this question's for you. How can independents influence energy policy in the federal parliament?
Look, I think this is in lots of different ways. I think I've spoken to Chris Bowen, I've spoken to Anthony Albanese. I think that the opportunity is that I think Labor is very aware that it's a strong that they have that they want to build, I think, sort of consensus and a sort of collaborative government, while at the same time, using their majority in the lower house, but they have no majority in the upper house, so they're going to have to work with the Greens. I think that what you can do as an independent is be a sort of constant advocate and actually for what is sensible policy in this area, put forward legislation of what is really sensible policy in this area and absolutely vote on it. In terms of what I will be putting forward, for example, is fuel efficiency standards in this country are absolutely critical. And so, I will be working with other crossbenchers on putting forward legislation around this and actually working and advocating with the government to say, this is something simple, it's easy, it's not going to cost the Australian taxpayer, but it will give us choice and is a critical part of our transition. And similarly, in terms of other areas, I've been pretty vocal about the government needing to do more in terms of holding the gas companies to account, because I actually want to help the government be able to make some of those more brave choices. And as an independent, you can actually go out the front and talk about things that perhaps the federal government doesn't have, isn't sure how everyone's going to react, and they're a bit more nervous because they've got the whole country to worry about. And I'm trying to, do that on this and on other sort of economic issues like tax reform and migration, because I think these are things that, the community is telling me, we can go further on this. And I want to try and make it easier for the government to make those brave policy choices by really sort of leading from the front. So I think that's what independents can do. I think they can advocate behind the scenes. They can build, I think, community and political cover, I think, for the government to make some of the braver choices, and then they can actually put forward legislation themselves and, you know, really work across the crossbench, across the Parliament, you know, and across both the House and the Senate to drive that.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for one more question, quickly, sorry. From David, we have the AEMO, the AEMC, the AER and the ACCC all playing a part in regulating, managing the NEM with inputs from both federal and state governments. Is the regulatory environment too complex to effectively manage the energy transition?
Tim, do you want to answer?
You go first.
Look, it's not too complex to manage the energy transition. It is absolutely very, very complex. But that doesn't mean that we don't have the right structures and frameworks to build off to manage this transition, because this transition is actually already happening, and it's happening, as I said, extremely quickly and even faster than these agencies have been forecasting that it would happen. And we've seen that they are able to step in and play a constructive role, especially since the Labor government was elected. So these organisations form the Energy Security Board, and they've been designing what the new electricity rules will look like for post-2025. And I think we can hope and absolutely push for those to be really constructive frameworks. And that there's no saying that we have to overhaul the entire system and start from scratch. We absolutely don't need to do that. This is already underway. It is happening. It's been in the works for years, and now we need to ramp up the pace and ramp up the ambition. We have the right tools to do that. We just need to get on with the job.
Yeah, I might add to that. Australia in some respects is leading the world in the energy transition. We've got the highest rooftop solar penetration in the world. That rooftop solar penetration is probably going to increase 400% in the next 28 years. Australia will still be very much at the world leading cutting edge. We need to modernise the regulatory framework. Do we have an alphabet soup? Should it be consolidated? Yes. But as Alia said, I mean, at the end of the day, it is a complex transition. What I think is critically important for the regulator was actually given by COAG 2 weeks ago, and that is that the energy market operator, the ESB, the ISP are all predicated on reliability and affordability. What they did not have was an explicit decarbonisation objective, and that was a categoric failure of the previous government for the last 9 years. Now, it was beautiful in the capacity mechanism report to see them explicitly acknowledge the decarbonisation objective as part of their framing. Failure to do that for the last 9 years has meant we have failed to deliver financial market policy frameworks that are actually going to see capital flow into the solutions. Finance is not going to fund high emission solutions, not globally. They've all aligned to the Paris Agreement. They've all committed to 1.5 degrees. And at the end of the day, the capital will only flow when you have reliability, affordability, and decarbonisation objectives. So I'm delighted that the first thing Chris Bowen did as the new Federal Energy Minister to bring that in, because every state and every territory has had that framework in place for years. And now we have it at the federal level. So that is great. That will unlock a huge amount of capital. And the faster we bring that capital to bear, the faster energy prices will collapse back to where they were 2 years ago and beyond, because renewables are massively deflationary in a country as blessed, as Allegra said, as Australia.
Okie doke. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alia, Allegra and Tim, for being with us at short notice to tackle this big issue. We really appreciate it. And to everyone watching, we hope that's clarified some of the complex issues behind the current issues with the NEM, as I've just learned how to say it, the NEM. We'll put the video of this discussion up on our YouTube channel and social shortly. Please look out for it and share it widely. Voices of Wentworth will be putting together its program of activities for the next 6 months, which will include community activities such as Voices in the Pub, as well as more town halls on topics that the people of Wentworth have told us they care about. Please join our mailing list. And if you'd like to volunteer with us, get in touch. Thank you so much for being with us, and have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.